Ubisoft have just finished off their E3 presser, having a bunch of existing titles that are being supported well and a bunch of new ones. But what I think's particularly interesting is that when you compare the business models of the industry, Ubisoft seem to be where EA wish they were. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another industry report. It is time to break down Ubisoft's E3 presence, one that's fairly interesting due to both their new games and also their Uplay Plus subscription service, something that, along with streaming, further shows us how the game industry business models are evolving. First though, let's just cover their new projects. We'll kick it off with Watch Dogs Legion, a game that seems to have went down incredibly well with audiences. Watch Dogs 1 was largely seen as a disappointment, being rather bland and of course being marketed using an E3 reveal trailer that really did not live up to the final product. Yet apparently Watch Dogs 2 was a far better game, and while it didn't do well, it seems to have at least recovered a bit of respect for the franchise. Watch Dogs Legion though seems like a rather large step forward, featuring London, a city that you don't actually see that often in games. Of course, it's not the London of today. The big headlines have been that it's a post-Brexit London. What does that really mean? Well, it's kind of hard to tell. The difference really with this game is Ubisoft are actually owning up to having a vaguely political setting. Now, they did say that it's not actually about Brexit itself, and it's more about the reasons that drove why people voted, I suppose. It's a very tricky subject to do right in a game, I'll admit. I'm going to assume what they're trying to say is that it's the late 20th century, early 21st century sort of, power structures sort of collapsing down a bit. So in Legion, the government is actually not that powerful. The streets of London are controlled by Albion, a private military who, of course, have loads of drones that you can hack. And you can see that, it could be sort of anti-current events, but it also could be a general take on London, which has been a very heavily surveilled city for years. When trying to tie together what all of this stuff means for their game, they said this: different opinions and worldviews, putting aside their differences, coming together to fight against the pressures that are trying to drive them apart. So that's kind of what they're doing there, I suppose. Make of it what you will. The game itself, though, is about growing the resistance to Albion, with Ubisoft saying that the no BS attitude of Londoners is a part of their inspiration for the game, and that's something that ties directly into their central gameplay mechanic, the ability to play as anyone. Yes, you can recruit any NPC in the game, and you can seemingly switch between them. These characters actually have permadeath, though you can actually surrender to Albion once you're confronted with a character. What's interesting, though, is that there's no protagonist in this game. You literally do play as the characters you recruit, eventually having up to 20 of them that you can play and GTA 5 style swap between. It seems pretty mental because this will work for, well, all of their digital Londoners. They somehow have this working with the game's narrative, and even with the characters all being voiced and being able to interact with each other. Which just means that the scale of this production must have been massive, and they must be using very crafty, incredible techniques to actually make this feasible. It seems like they're really committing to this, with their NPCs having fully simulated lives and the whole thing being driven by Census, a big relational database of NPCs that is procedurally generated for your run of the game, containing all of their relationships with each other, all their thoughts, perks, etc. They seemingly are using voice modulation to get the number of voices that they need, but even with that, it's just a damn impressive feat. Now, of course, the devil is in the detail with this game. A lot of it, gameplay-wise, does just look like Watch Dogs, so we'll just have to see how these concepts translate to a full-scale gameplay experience. But at least right now, I think they've managed to get people's attention, and that's certainly not something they were able to do with Watch Dogs 2. So, a developing story, and we'll just have to see how it ends up being, but they've certainly made a splash with this whole control any NPC thing. Then next up, we've got Roller Champions. It's essentially Rocket League, but it's roller derby. I imagine that the distinction, in those sort of sports will be pretty noticeable in the gameplay, and just from looking at it, yeah, looks perfectly reasonable. It looks like it would be really fun if that's the type of your game that you're into, so yeah, there's that. Then moving on, Gods and Monsters. This is a new and utterly gorgeous game from Ubisoft Quebec that releases February 5th, 2020, so pretty soon. And as much as Watch Dogs kind of look cool and just seeing London was a bit neat, the art style of this really did grab me, especially the environments. Now, they say this is an adventure to save the gods, seemingly through a range of different places, fighting a variety of different creatures, seemingly all, of course, from Greek mythology, which makes sense when you see that this is from the Assassin's Creed Odyssey creators. So that's one pretty cool game. Next, let's move on to Rainbow Six Quarantine. This is, okay, maybe a bit less creative aesthetically, but it certainly could be a gripping and interesting game. It seems like the Rainbow Six zombie event went down well enough for them to turn that into a full spin-off title. Now, sure, Might not be the most high-effort creative thing in the universe, but at least it's a pretty savvy thing to do, right? They had a game idea, they decided to field test it in a live game, they saw that people enjoyed it, and then they committed to just spinning it out into a full release. And that does seem pretty reasonable, given how loved Siege is and how the event was actually pretty well received. And I'm sure many people will just want to play their Siege characters in a new way, and this will provide them with that. I suppose it's a pretty good example of just using events to field test new ideas, and if those events play out well enough, then hey, they can turn into a full game. Next, though, we have two smaller announcements. So, speaking of Tom Clancy games, we also got a mobile title called Elite Squad. And it does include Sam Fisher, but maybe not in the way that many Splinter Cell fans, myself included, would have wanted, but hey, Jason Schreier did sort of warn us not to expect much from Splinter Cell. Now, as for the game itself, well, fundamentally it seems to be XCOM-like in its combat. Now, if it cost $4.99, then sure, I'd assume it was a good premium title, but it is a free-to-play, so I don't trust them to mess up the balance, or not to mess up the balance in the name of monetization, so there's that. And then they did announce a new Just Dance 2020, that, as the naming convention goes, comes out November 2019. So, that's it for their new games. Let's talk about the streaming service. Uplay Plus is a PC streaming service that essentially is what you would expect now that we're all used to Origin Access, Premiere, and Microsoft Game Pass. So, Uplay Plus does not have a cheaper option, only having a $14.99 per month subscription, which is right up there with EA Origin Access's most expensive tier. Now, for that, you'll get the deluxe version of every Ubisoft game, as well as all their season passes. That includes the earliest available access to their games, and interestingly, it will also work on Stadia, something that's really important for Google's business model, as we'll cover later. Now, is this worth the price? That's kind of tricky. If you love Ubisoft games and you play them all, sure, and you want all the DLC, it could actually make sense for you. But say if Rainbow Six Siege is the only thing you're interested in, well then this probably would not make much sense for you to be involved with. Ubisoft's overall model though is pretty darn clear. They support their games very well, I'll say that much. They tend to have solid DLCs on a fairly regular basis, so if you liked Siege and say Assassin's Creed and Ghost Recon, then yeah, it's a lot of content. I mean between Siege, Assassin's Creed, Ghost Recon, The Division, and a bunch of the other games, it's a lot of content. That's not counting the other things like For Honor, Gods and Monsters, and Watch Dogs. It essentially seems like Ubisoft are where EA want to be. They have a large roster of games that they update fairly regularly. I'm not saying that it's the best thing ever that they have a bunch of rolling live services, but it at least seems like they're pulling that off successfully. And then as for what this means for Stadia, well, here's something similar. In the UK, we have Amazon Prime, right? But then you can also get a Starz subscription if you want to watch a Starz show like Counterpart. So you've got Amazon Prime and its subscription, and then your Starz subscription. And I wonder if that's what Stadia is going to end up sort of like. If it will be that it's the platform with its own subscription service, but then that you've got all these bolt-on subscription services on top of that if you want additional content for publishers who are not included in the Stadia membership, which probably will be most of them. That could end up being a reasonable model for some consumers, but it really could end up being a lot of money and not really being that great. Now that said, if you loved Ubisoft games enough to have a Uplay Plus subscription and it transferred over, then you could just have Stadia Basic, which is free, and play their games. Now sure, it will be down at 1080p, but if you're stuck somewhere without a PC or a console, that could be an okay added bonus. Now that said, if the Stadia version of Uplay Plus costs extra and is a separate subscription or something like that, well, that would be far from ideal. So that is our major big reveals, but we do have key updates to their existing titles. Assassin's Creed Odyssey is getting a quest creator and a discovery mode, with the former allowing you to create quests with branching dialogues. It really does seem to be quite in-depth indeed, so that's very cool to see. And then there's discovery mode, which is out there for exploring the world, including tours of areas with historical quizzes. It will release as a part of an autumn game update, and also will have a standalone client, which is something that, say, if I was a history teacher, might be a cool learning aid, as much as, yes, it is still a fantastical depiction of ancient Greece. Then Brawlhalla is getting an Adventure Time themed expansion, and they also talked up Ghost Recon Breakpoint a little bit more. Not really anything major here, they just talked about a new community program and how they really want strong post-launch content, which is what you'd expect from an Ubisoft game these days, and that the beta will start September 5th. Then For Honor is getting a time-limited event that's a co-op boss fight against a samurai boss, with The Division 2 also being talked about continuing its strong post-launch support, with them talking about the next 2 episodes of game content, including a raid on the Pentagon and a trip back to New York. Seemingly solid content updates to a well-received game that's a rare example of a live service seemingly done right from the start, even if it did have to be built off the back of Division 1's rather messy launch. Oh, and then they also talked about their TV show with Rob McElhenney, so, I mean, there's that. And really, where does this leave us? Well, I'm not going to sit here and say that I love how all of these games have just been sort of morphed into live services, because it does mean that when I turn on Assassin's Creed Odyssey, if you want the version of it that's balanced, that's, the 50% boost. And it's got all the cosmetic DLC and all of that stuff, which I do genuinely believe makes elements of that game worse, because I'd rather that armor was there as a part of a really hard legendary quest that could drive some really, engaging gameplay. So I think those elements do suck, and I'm not 100% on board with what Ubisoft are doing. What I will say, though, is, yes, they successfully have a number of quite popular games that have been very well received. They are pretty darn good at giving those games regular updates. They seemingly are pretty reasonable with their community and all of that stuff. And that's really why I said at the top of this that they seem to be where EA want to be. They've got The Division 2, by all accounts, a pretty darn successful game. Whereas EA have Anthem, a massive, massive mess up. And at least with The Division 2, people are getting their episodic content that seemingly, from what I hear, has been pretty well received. And you really have that for all of the major Ubisoft games, and then one assumes that's just going to be their model moving forward for future games. Could it be good? Yes, it could be. Will it have downsides? I'd say probably, but I suppose it's just interesting seeing different companies trying similar business models and the varying degrees of success that those companies have, and just from a consumer's perspective, how different it looks, because Ubisoft, they're trying something similar to EA, but they look so much better than EA do right now. And I think that's very interesting indeed. So be sure to let me know what you think about Ubisoft as a company and the games mentioned today, and of course that subscription service. I mean, hey, are we going to be having your Game Pass subscription, your Stadia subscription, your Origin Access subscription, your Game Pass subscription, your Game Pass Ultimate? I mean, it's a lot of subscriptions, isn't it? So let me know. Thank you very much for watching. There'll be one more video on the channel today, so be sure to check that out. And with all that, I'll see you next time.